Gail, thank you so much for taking the time out of your studio day to jump on here and have a conversation about your work. I've really been looking forward to it.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, for all of you listening, I have been following Gail's work for quite some time, and we are just kind of reminiscing before we jumped on to the interview about how we ran into each other in the streets of Queens, right? It was like nighttime, you were having a show, and it's one of those moments where it's just really cool to know that the world is so big, yet what we do, we're brought together in smaller spaces, and it feels kismet in many ways too. So that was just a wonderful moment.
Absolutely. I was lucky that you were there.
It was really fun. Um, so the way I really like to start off these conversations is to learn more about you and your history. So if you could just share with us a little bit about your background, maybe where you're from originally, where you went to school, and how you started to get into the arts.
Sure. So I grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut. Um, so I'm from New England. And both of my parents valued culture. They were makers themselves in a way. My dad was a salesman, and my mom was a secretary. But they both, um, but they both used their hands and were project people. My grandparents, my grandparents on my mother's side, my grandfather came from a family of 7 boys who were all construction workers. So my uncles were all construction workers. And my dad was sort of had the pious intellectual side of the family. So one side boisterous, the other side a little quieter, and connected to spirituality in a way that my mom wasn't. Anyway, uh, my mom was an amateur painter, and she always had a crewel project or a knitting project. She liked to also make collages. And my dad was an amateur photographer, and so we had a darkroom in the basement. So I would sit and move the photo paper from tray to tray with him and watch the images appear in the developing process, much like one watches a painting appear as you're making it. In the summertime, we summered in a house on the Connecticut shore in Clinton, Connecticut, and my mom and several of the women in this place that we lived would take a painting class in this woman's house, Bertha Schulman's house, down the street. And so the male teacher would come and set up a still life, and the women would paint there. And I would go and watch that from time to time. So I was exposed to culture at an early age. My parents took me to museums. They took me to shows in New York. Also, they were really impeccable with visual order. They liked their house to be ordered. They took pride in their objects and the way the house was arranged. And everything was folded in their closets, which I don't do now. But in my painting, I do it, right? Everything was folded in their closets. Everything was arranged. There was a big cornucopia on the table at Thanksgiving. I think, though, one of the most influential things that kind of penetrated my visual field was the way they populated their living room. So it was empty for my early childhood, like, maybe up till 10 or 11 or something like that, or maybe I'm making that age up. So it was a white room with a white carpet with nothing in it, and I loved it. And then they got a yellow ochre couch, and then they got 2 sort of olive green love seats. And then progressively, they filled that room in with the rest of the furniture. So I mention this because I think I make my paintings like that also, and maybe I'll talk a bit about that more later. But I also loved playing with this thing called color forms, which is this, like, it's not really a game. It's like a plastic mat with an image on it. It could have a farm or it could have an interior or something. And then you have these things that you stick on and you move them around, or you dress somebody and you move them around. And I think those two things sort of informed what the way I go about making my work now. So my parents were really supportive. I went to a good art high school. They had a good art department. And they had this thing in high school where you could do like an exchange. I can't remember exactly how it worked, but I was able to take a class at the Hartford Art School. We lived around the corner from the University of Hartford. And so I took my first drawing class. I drew my first nude there when I was 16. I took a class at the Hartford Art League and drew, I don't, I'm not a figurative painter, but figure was is what I did then. Um, and then at some point I decided to be an artist in high school. I applied to the University of, it was the University of Portland Gorham. It's now the University of Maine. Only one school, like not now, like now your kids apply for like a million schools and they go around. I had never been to Maine. I had never, you know, really Massachusetts, not really very many of the New England states. And I applied, got accepted, went to undergrad there. And early on, when I was going to be, as a freshman, I thought I was going to major in art therapy or art education because my dad was like, you want to do that. And I think my second semester, I said, nope, I'm going to be a painter. I think he took me to a show at the Whitney Museum, and I was there, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to be a painter. So I was supported by my parents. And then while I was in Maine, or while I was at the university, I studied with really philosophers. They didn't teach you how to paint then, right? Not like it is now. Like I learned how to paint because I taught. So it was more philosophizing. So, I maybe thought about painting as a way of understanding the world or understanding myself, my experience. And at the same time I was doing that, I started working with shoestring theater here in Portland with some colleagues, my dear friend Tim Lee, some colleagues from my undergrad. So I was working on large puppet parades, kind of a la Bread and Puppet. They were like an a la Bread and Puppet kind of a thing. And lived in a house for a little while with many of the puppeteers and ate a lot of garlic and raw garlic. And actually toured the state and did shows around the state and made the puppets. And while I was living with them, I was finishing undergrad and I was wondering what the next step would be. And I thought I was going to move back home and move to Israel. That was kind of what I thought I would do. And then one day I woke up, I thought there's no way I can go live home again ever. And somebody in this shoestring house said to me, hey, there's this guy who does an experimental theater out in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, Chris Hardman. And they called it the Sausalito Puppet Theater. And so I said, okay. And I went to California and found my way to Chris eventually, and worked with Chris Hardman Antenna Theater, which was experimental theater in the 80s. This was the early 80s. And worked with him for several years and didn't take the normal linear path that many take, where you go to undergrad and then you go to grad school and then you start to teach. In fact, didn't occur to me to ever teach until quite a few years after I got out of grad school. So I worked with Chris Hardman, and then I also landed in this place that really shaped my life quite a bit, Galilee Harbor Community Association, which is still in Sausalito. It's a 40 boat, low income housing project, really. And I lived with a group of people that were amazing, and boatwrights and sailors and writers and artists and activists we all lived on a boat, and we all created this scene together, which really informed, well, it reinforced the idea that magic happens in one's life. Like, I found my way to this place through my intuitive sort of Geiger, dowsing mechanism, and ended up with this creative bunch of people that I'm still in touch with, many of them, who decided to live in a different way. And in the meantime, at that time, I also worked with, before I moved there, I was living at the Whole Earth Catalog. There was a house where Whole Earth Catalog people were living. And I worked with Susan Davis Frank on a project for the Well, which was a Whole Earth Catalog project. And I did a bunch of stuff. I'll just say, I did a bunch of great stuff. It was a 10-year run of amazing sailing in the bay, working on wooden boats, having a lot of bad relationships. And eventually in 1985, I decided to go to grad school. So I went to the San Francisco Art Institute, and was influenced by the people that I worked with. Although I have to say my life in Sausalito is much more interesting than grad school. I wasn't really, I don't have a background where I actually understood what I was doing. I don't even know if I understand what I'm doing now. But I look at my former students and the students that I've worked with and the ones that are really happening right now. They just knew right away, this is it. They knew what to do. I never followed that track. I kind of followed my nose and landed in places that seemed like the good idea at the time. So, so I worked before I left the Bay Area, I worked for this project called Call of the Sea. It was a sail training outfit that was going to build a tall ship. There was a point that I thought I was going to be a sailor, which was silly because I'm really not a very good sailor. But I thought that way of living life sounded great to me. And wooden boats were just total romance and just amazing. My work is influenced a lot by the art of wooden boat building. I think I would have been a wooden boat builder if I had done something else. So I was working for Call of the Sea, and I met somebody who was coming back to Maine to build a tall ship. And I knew I'd always come back to Maine. I just didn't know when. And that job led me to moving back here to Bath, Maine, to work on this project to build a tall ship. And when that kind of started to be like, I don't know that I want to keep doing this, somebody said, well, you have your MFA, you could teach. And so that's how I got to the Maine College of Art and Design, and 30 years gone by.
That's incredible.
I know. What did you ask me?
No, that was it. That was exactly
Okay.
it. I love hearing these tales of formation of self, where we're trying to figure out, okay, am I going to go here? Am I going to do that? And I love that you were doing so much building and ended up in San Francisco with that. And I had no idea that you were in boat building with that. It's so funny. My first time to Maine actually was to visit my undergrad roommate, and she was in Maine building boats. And I left New York City. I was living in New York, and I remember I was so excited to get out of the city because I realized I'd been missing the horizon line and like how much that interests me. And it was to go to Maine on a bus and see her. We bought lobsters. Anyway, it was a whole thing. It was wonderful. It was such a good moment. Good people. Um, but one thing I think that's really interesting that you said is that there are people who are like, they know what they're going to do, they do it, they execute it, ABC kind of way of moving, and that there's nothing right or wrong about how we move through life, of course, but there's people that kind of follow that path. And then you had this like beautiful story and life of relationships. It sounds like relationships were incredibly important, so it was about coming together to create these things like the puppets and the puppeteers. There's typically a group coming together. I don't know a ton about boat building, but it feels like you would have to have others around you, and so I feel like there's this thread there, that even once you go into teaching, it's about relationships. I find that fascinating.
Well, it is. I have to say that 10 years in at Galilee Harbor, which is still there, still thriving. I mean, Marin County is one of the wealthiest counties in the US, and Sausalito is a really high-end situation. And the people that, without going into too much history about that whole location, the people who have created this community and its legacy, I've never really been able to find that again. And I've searched for it. Certainly, working at the Maine College of Art and Design I had a great run with a bunch of colleagues for a long time. And, we're still, some of them are still working, some of them are retired now. And, we're still connected. And certainly my lineage as an artist comes out of working with them. At this time of my life, I wish I could, it's hard to generate community because we are all so separate. It was so awesome to be living as neighbors and working together and problem solving together. It was a really unusual and fabulous opportunity. I mean, I guess I could say the same thing with the puppet theater or with antenna theater, but there was a boss there. Like it was like, you worked for somebody. Maybe Shoestring was more of an open-ended kind of a situation, but yeah, you're right. I mean, it's all about relationships, really. And even in our solo pursuit as painter, as well, as a painter, I mean, I am alone a lot. I mean, look, I'm getting to talk to you, so it's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like this different type of community. I think like when we get older and there's not as many, like, well, I'm going to go live with these 6 people because I need to, which, that was how I met a lot of people in New York. Um, and you get in this groove, and we kind of crave this alone time though, too, so it's like we get to be in our studio doing this solo thing, but then we come together at openings or randomly on the streets of Queens, with like-minded people who are pursuing something similar. And I think it goes back to something you said in the beginning, which is, it's about being, this philosophy of being. You weren't being taught about like, here's how we're going to paint this and here's perspective, etc., but rather this inquiry into looking at our experience and our life, and I think when it really comes down to it, most painters and artists I know who continue doing it, we're really kind of after something like that. But I'm so excited to take all of this to the paintings you're making. I've been like looking at your work. And I hadn't thought of looking at them through this lens, but since we're talking about this idea of relationships, um, is that the objects in your paintings are kind of relational to each other, and yet they also suggest a moment where people have just left or have just, they were there and then they're going on with the shoes or the teacups I'm kind of looking at. So I'd love to before we dive into all of the work with that, if you could just tell us a little bit about where you are now and what a day in the studio looks like for you.
Oh, it's awesome. I'm not really, maybe a couple of years ago, I would have said I'm a recovering, academic, but I'm not really recovering that much anymore. It's fabulous. I wake up, I'm a early riser, 5:30. I sit in my chair. I think, I drink my coffee. I do my writing or reading or correspondence at that time. I walk the dog in the woods. I do I'm, big body movement exercise. I run errands. I have lunch, and around 1 or 2 o'clock, I go to the studio. I do that for a couple of hours and then feed the dog, walk, the dog defines a lot of my day. Feed the dog, walk the dog, make dinner, and go have dinner with my husband, go back to the studio until around 9 or 9:30. So I get in around 4 to 6 hours a day.
Mhm.
Um, I Painting is integrated into my daily life. I walk, I eat, I paint. In this way, it's really an ordinary act. It's arranging colored shapes on a surface. Um, I I also think of it a little bit as a domestic act, similar maybe to the Victorian women or something, like it's a genteel activity. I don't really think of it that way, but if I start to think of it as a domestic act, it kind of falls under that category. Um, I love a steady rhythm,
Mhm.
and that shows in my work as well. I think that the rhythm of the day and a steady rhythm or a repeated rhythm amplifies the creative process or allows the creative process to um, uh, get grounded or be rooted. Um, Now, having said that, I also feel that, shaking up the routine is important. Like living life means living life. And so I also like to make myself feel a little afraid, like to do things that are outside the routine. Um, but my work is like a performance of slowness at this time. And I think that's what happens as we get older naturally also. Um, for some like to, be on it I think it benefits my work. I think it benefits the presence of the work. Um, and I just like that routine. So, um, yeah, that I guess it's pretty idyllic, actually. It's like a constant residency, really.
Sounds amazing. I mean, I love looking at your morning and, we were talking prior to jumping onto the interview a little bit about the rhythm of a day or routine and how it can shift. And so I think that sounds wonderful. Now, when you're in your studio, are you someone who works on one piece and finishes it, or do you have multiple pieces going? What does that kind of look like for you?
No, I'm kind of I'm a workhorse.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So I just got 24 canvases. So I just did, like I was telling you earlier, I just did this big show in Dubai with Taymour Grahne projects. There were 17 paintings in that show.
Mm.
I made them over a period of not even a year.
Yeah.
And so, no, um, I like to build the whole thing together. If I'm usually working towards a show, and even if I don't have a show, I make a fake show. Like I imagine a space and I make the work for the space that's imagined in my head. So I build them all up at the same time. All of them are touched. and then all of them are touched again. And then I start to isolate, I start to work on one at a time. But it enables me to think about like the audience's experience, working on more than once, a lot of them at one time, enables me to think about the audience's experience, moving in and out of each piece, like as an installation, as a spatial experience, how to create a situation where, we know paintings are windows, but they also inject presence into a room, as well as receding back in space. So for me, building the whole thing up at once is helpful. And I also make colored decisions this way and think about, I have like 3 lighter paintings. I need to make a few darker paintings. So it's a collection. I like to watch Project Runway, so I feel like I make a collection, right? It's like that for me. And then the subject matter kind of riffs off each other. It gives me stuff to work back and forth about. So I'm really and I like to paint large. So I'm really I can't work on one at a time. I kill them if I do that.
I totally feel you. I love that. Some people are like, no, I must finish this one, which is, their deal. But then there's others that are like, you're building it up as a collection together, responding back and forth, back and forth. I'd also love to know, how do you start a painting? Do you do a lot of sketches beforehand? Are these scenes from your own home, scenes that you've kind of created in your mind? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I don't draw in advance. In the past, in the very few times I've done that, it feels like it doesn't work for me to translate a drawing into a painting. And if I start that way, sometimes I'll do a quick sketch. If I start that way, it inevitably changes. I work directly on the canvas. I divide the canvas up into segments. I think about like it's like a 2D design project almost. I also think about, is this a landscape? Is it an interior? Is it a combination of both? And then as I build it up, I take photos and I work in the iPad. I put them in an iPad, and I'm very remedial with Photoshop. I don't know a lot about, so it's very like amateurish how I approach the Photoshop, but I'll do some drawing and I'll change the composition. As I go, oftentimes I work over and over and over a piece and erase out. I will sometimes get to 90% of done and I will erase the whole thing. It's all about finding the composition in order to move to the end for me, and how to make an image that has some kind of graphic quality, emotional quality, isn't too literal, like possibly can cause a viewer to have some kind of common ground or contact, or expresses a sensation. Like that's always at the fore of the each painting. Like, how do I make an image that transcends the image? So it's a lot of putting in and taking out, erasing. And like I said early on with the color forms and the way my parents did their living room, I paint from the bottom up. So I think a faculty said that to me in grad school. Like, if you're going to paint water, paint the ocean floor and paint up. Right. And I took that really, I do that. So I will, like I tried to do some swimming pool paintings recently. And so I tiled the bottom of the pool, and then I put the water in. It's like built, it's very built to me.
It makes sense too, in terms of thinking of like your history with building things. You know what I mean? Like the construction seems very important as you're talking about the paintings, and historically has been really important. Um, I love how you were talking about the emotional quality of your paintings and finding this common ground. So you're like drawing somebody into the piece. And I think one of the things that I'm always really struck by in your work, or at least looking at some of your more recent work, is the inclusion of shoes. And I'd mentioned earlier, in terms of thinking of relationships, this inclusion of multiple pairs of shoes, I begin to read almost as relationships, like, oh, did these three people take their shoes off and now they're out playing cards together while they're having a drink or something? And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the inclusion of shoes in your paintings and the different types you have.
Well, so Morris Hirschfeld had a show at the Folk Art Museum, whenever, like 2023 maybe. And he's one of, folk art. I think my works kind of, has that folk artness in it, and like New England kind of flat and early American portraiture kind of thing. So I saw that show, and he was a shoemaker, and he made felt slippers, these amazing felt slippers, and they were in the show. My dad had a shoe store. He was a haberdasher. And so, I would go there and I would try on the shoes. But that wasn't the thing that prompted me to do it. It was really seeing Morris Hirschfeld's shoes. And then I went and did a residency at the Ucross Foundation, which is where the first shoes kind of entered the picture. And it was really about asking the question, how do I engage my imagination more? Certainly there's a nod to the figure that's not there, to the action that's taking place off the screen, to the identity of the people that are like, these were kind of fairy shoes for me, like they were princess slippers, really. They were a nod to sort of taking on that persona in a very minimal way. So it has all of that wrapped up in it. And I feel like they're more, they're not inanimate, like shoes they're not alive, obviously, but they are in a different way than a vase is. I mean, the dog in my work, which the dog has been in my work since I was in grad school. I painted my dogs on and off for years. That's the closest, and the birds are the breathing things. But it was a way for me to also inject another breathing things. And I'm very kind of selective about that. What can show up and yeah. So I hope I answered. So the role of imagination really was the prompt, which is a question for me now. Like, how do I tap my imagination? What does it mean to tap imagination at this time? Is it going to give me more freedom to say what I want to say? I'm a little shy. And so it's possible also that the shoes were also a way to add more personal depth to the work. At this age, I feel like it's important, it's like urgent at this point to be as intimate with it as I can get. So that's another kind of layer, to why the shoes.
I,
Yeah.
I love the shoes. And I was going to ask you about the dog, the inclusion of the dog as well. I keep going back to this one painting, Pearl with Boots and Pheasants. I'm obsessed with this painting. It is so good. And what I love too is like, I love your handling of objects and how, there's a lot of pattern that you utilize in your work. And so in the dog, at first, when I first looked at it, I almost read it as a tabletop and like a sculpture of a dog. And then I was like, but why would there be shoes on the tabletop? And then that's when I started to read into it. And I love when I can read paintings in multiple ways and have a moment like that, because I think that can be hard to do and accomplish in a painting. So I just keep going back to that piece and how you describe the night with these almost waves, you know. Um, and we've talked a bit about patterning in your work. Um, and I'm curious, and by the way, I love the shoes in this one too with the flowers, those boots.
Mm.
I want to wear those boots.
Mm.
um, could you talk a little bit about, like, do you also enjoy like looking at pattern and studying pattern, or are you someone who's more like, I'm just going to kind of create my own pattern for what works for this piece?
Well, so let me say a couple things and I'll answer the question on pattern. So the work is always an amalgamation. I mean, I think many artists' work are like a tumbleweed of, or an amalgamation of our experience. We take, we pick and choose and it comes in. It's like recipes, different recipes show up. So that particular painting was an amalgamation of those shoes. My dad's shoe store, there were go-go boots there, and I wanted them. And they wouldn't let me have the ones that were patterned. They would let me have the white ones, but not the patterned ones. So the go-go boots. So that's to be perfectly honest, that's as close to me in the painting, like literally myself in the painting as I get. I was at Ucross when I made that painting. My studio door looked out and there were pheasants. The pheasants were there. And the dog was, home. So the amalgamation of that, my paintings, and I think paintings are amalgamations of experience. So as far as pattern goes, it functions a bunch of different ways. Yes, I mean, I'm a sucker for walking into a fabric store. And I love looking at patterns. I think well, there's an optical decadence to the use of patterns. One of the people that influenced my work while I was early on in my teaching was Shirley Kaneda.
Oh, I love Shirley Kaneda.
Yeah, yeah. That was a moment that the pattern didn't really exist in the work before her.
Mhm.
And so when I saw that work, somehow it gave me permission to use pattern so that there was a lot of figure ground action. I struggle back and forth sometimes between how much I would like a lot of figure ground action. Like I would be an abstract painter really if I didn't like to paint objects as much. So the optical activity that patterns enable me to do for the viewer, for myself and for the viewer, like one of the things about painting is perceptual, right? If you can get a viewer to recognize, wow, my eyes are going crazy, like I think that's very awesome. So the pattern functions that way. And then, of course, it's like the pattern and decoration movement, uh, or Matisse's, you know, armchair, painting is an armchair in which to rest. Pattern and decorations movie, it's the antidote to, the severe minimalists, to have pleasure, to have optical pleasure. Um, and in one of her essays, Helen Molesworth writes about Larry Pittman, who says that pattern or decoration is an antidote to violence, which for me is very, is also has to do with how I want my work to function, as a place that's peaceful. Um, and then the other part of it is the repetition is a metronome. Like I talked about my routine. It's like, I like that. Like, I know what I'm doing. Like it actually on a really ground level, it's like, oh, I'll paint this pattern. I don't have to figure out any problems in this painting. I'll just paint this pattern. And the color part is really fun. So I'll just, I'll think about where the light's coming. So it's like that. It's like, so it functions on a lot of levels.
Oh, I love that. You have such great pattern in this, a great color. So we had mentioned or touched on this earlier, but I want to dive into it a little bit more, which is you just had a show in Dubai. You recently got back. So can you please tell us a bit about that show, the work that's in it, and also just about being in Dubai?
I would love to do that. Taymour Grahne projects. Well, Taymour decided to move to Dubai and offered me this inaugural show. And I said yes. The show is still up. It's called Arranging Flowers, um, which is a nod to uh, a layer, a bunch of layers of things. But if I was to pick one of them, it would be the act of arranging flowers is an act of care. And it's an everyday act. It's a simple act. It's something that many, many, many people do, or many people appreciate. I mean, I'm forgetting her name now, the photographer who did the flower arrangements that were sitting on conference tables in very highly charged political places. I mean, I wish I could remember her name. Flower arrangements sit in these highly charged rooms. They're there for celebrations and for deaths and births. They're an action of care and they're a thing of beauty. And so having that be the show that I brought to a place that was really way out of my experience globally, right? I've been to Europe, but I felt like I was like really in the world there.
Yeah.
It was kind of my attention and it was the intention behind the work.
Yeah. I love that idea of these highly charged spaces that these arrangements sit in to bring comfort, to bring acknowledgement, just this like witness of sorts, that is there in these spaces. Well, congratulations on that show. I'm so excited it's still up for you right now. What a wonderful place to be exhibiting. Um, so one other thing I want to ask you before we jump off here, which I'm having such a great time talking to you about your work and life, and that question is, you are just rocking it right now, like you said, solo show in Dubai at this moment, other projects that you've recently had, exhibitions on the horizon, all of these things, and you've also had this rich history of teaching as well. And many people who are listening, they may be in the middle of their career, at the end of the career, or beginning. Um, do you have any advice that you've learned along the way that you could share with somebody who is maybe starting out or in the middle of it, not really, they're just trying to get their footing, etc.? Is there anything you could share with them?
Well, that's a hard question, because there's a lot
I
of
know.
things you could share, but I'm gonna give you two. Okay, so in graduate school, my teacher Barbara Rogers talked about defining success, and that's still really a slippery idea. And so what does it mean to lead a life of satisfaction and contentment? Um, rather than chasing something that might be outside of that. Um, and that's a fine line. And we all go through our things where we learn as we go. At the time she said it, I defined success as that I would keep painting, which I've done. Since that time, I would tell this to students periodically, add a couple more things to that,
Mhm.
like I want a family, or I want to make money selling work,
Mhm.
which nobody ever said to me, and is possible. Or I want to own my house. Like add to be more specific. I was very specific, but I only had one thing on the list. So luckily I feel very successful now. And then the other thing I would say is, well, for me at this point, satisfaction and contentment are really how I define it. And then the other thing I would say is that magic happens. You have to just keep your antenna up for it. And you really have to short circuit a lot of the other stuff that comes in. Could I have told you that words like I'm having a show in Dubai would come out of my mouth? No, or any of it that I taught, or that I did anything I've done in my life, or that I lived in that community, or that, I'm looking out my window at the beautiful leaves here in Maine. Like, no, I would never have known it. But the words about Dubai were really reinforced the idea that magic keeps happening. So keep your antenna up for that in your own
Oh,
practice and in your life.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much, Gail. This has been such a pleasure to connect with you and talk to you about what you're working on in your life. Can you tell us where we can find you online?
GailSpaien.com and at Gail Spaien Instagram. If you're in Dubai, catch the show that's currently up. The Center for Maine Contemporary Art Biennial is up. I have work there. Berggruen in San Francisco, a group show right now. And then in Seattle, at Studio E Gallery, will open next month.
Great. Excellent. Well, Gail, again, thank you for taking the time to be on here. And it was such a pleasure to connect with you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.